2%. Japan, very, very tough, great people. And again, I don't blame the people for doing it. I think they're very smart in doing it. I blame the people that sat right in that Oval Office, right over there, right behind the Resolute desk or whichever desk they chose. Japan, 46%. They would charge us 46%.
If you are still watching, we thank you. If you are watching and you are confused, we're here to help you. I'm going to bring into our coverage Bloomberg News anchor and correspondent David Gura. David, let me do a little bit of fact-checking thanks to our friends over at the New York Times. Just on the trade deficits that he keeps talking about. Times reports that Trump talks about the trade deficits the United States has amassed with other countries and says, quote, we're really not taking it anymore. The trade deficit is the difference between what a country exports and imports. The U.S. has long imported more goods than it exports. Trump said his tariffs offered an example of his administration standing up for our great farmers and ranchers. As a reminder, though, the administration had to offer special federal aid to farmers who were hurt by his trade war with China during his first term. The White House recently discussed doing that again. The 25% tariff on cars and car parts that Trump is talking about goes into effect just after midnight. The United Auto Workers Union is a strong supporter of those tariffs. But auto companies and economists have said they will lead to significantly higher car prices and could even slow U.S. auto production in the short run with supply chain issues. I want to also talk about, this is all sort of a cherry-picked selection, but the Times also with this fact check, quote, Trump is mentioning many high tariffs that other countries put on American products, but not the high tariffs that the United States charges on certain products. And then they go through the list of things we are, I guess, in Trump's narrative on the other side of the tariff dynamic. In terms of nodding to the fact that none of his economic advisors prior to serving in Donald Trump's cabinet ever advocated for tariffs, talk about what has been put in place so far today.
So we're going to learn more details here, probably not from the chart that the president is holding up there, but we know that there's going to be this 10% universal tariff. This is something that he talked about a lot on the campaign trail, and he's characterizing the reciprocal tariffs that he's putting in place here is kind of benevolent, as less than they could have been. He could have gone full, he said, but he didn't. But what's going to be interesting to watch here is how all of these trading partners, these countries respond to what the president is putting in place. And you bring up the auto tariffs, for instance. This is something that he talked about before, so he's kind of couching this as a novel announcement today. We knew that those were going to be put in place, those 25% tariffs on foreign imports of automobiles and parts. You're right to point out that these are economic advisors who aren't well known for espousing a lot of interest in or hope for these tariffs before they got into that position. But what we've heard from the White House time and time again is this is an economic team that has walked in line here with the president who, as we know and we've known for so long, really believes in the power of these tariffs, despite in a lot of cases what consensus tells us, what most economists say the effects of these tariffs are going to be. So, again, it'll be interesting to see sort of what the response is now that we have this announcement. And so the story that we've talked about over these last many weeks, Nicole, is just the level of uncertainty that this process has kind of infused into markets and the economy and the way that countries act in regard to the United States. There's a bit more clarity here. I think that you're seeing kind of in the market response that we're seeing in the futures market, some relief. Probably these tariffs aren't as big as perhaps many investors worried or thought they might be. But again, this is kind of the beginning stage of sort of figuring out what happens next and how open this president is negotiating around these tariffs as well. I think that we haven't heard much from him yet in this speech in the Rose Garden about his appetite for doing that. And I'll just say lastly, this has been the open question that a lot of investors and observers have had over the course of his second term. Are these negotiating gambits? Is this a mechanism by which companies and sectors and countries will have an opportunity to kind of work with the White House to figure out a trade deal that's palatable to the White House? I don't think that we know that yet, Nicole.
I wonder, because tariffs are so unpopular and, in the view of economists, ineffective as economic tools, it's worth explaining that they are regressive taxes, that annual losses for households at the bottom of the income distribution would range from about $1,900 to $2,400. Food prices will go up 1.85%. For all of those voters who were agitated by the price of things like eggs, tariffs, and this isn't any sort of partisan analysis that we've eyeballed here, but tariffs indisputably will make things more expensive.
You know, the thing to which economists look is the Smoot-Hawley Act from 1930. That was seen as a colossal mistake by the U.S. government putting those broad-based tariffs in place. And I should say they were put in place by Congress. That's not what's happening here. This is the president doing this unilaterally, but of course with the support of the Republican Party, but not done by Congress. That was seen as a cautionary tale for many decades of protectionism. And so we've learned lessons from that. Over almost a whole century, this flies in the face of that. And so you're right to bring up the fact that if you look at that as a guideline, if you look at kind of traditional mainstream economics as a guideline here, the result of that is these tariffs are going to be inflationary. They're going to lead to higher prices. And you heard the president in his remarks nodding to the fact that his administration is focused on lowering prices and intends to do so, echoing what he said on the campaign trail. But most economists would say this is not going to do that. This is going to complicate matters even more. And I thought an interesting allowance was from that worker from the UAW, who was part of, I think, the founder of that group, UAW Auto Workers for Trump. He says he can't wait to see what happens in 3 months or 6 months or in a few years. I think that there is a new reckoning with, a new realization of the fact that this is going to lead to short-term, perhaps medium-term pain. And I was struck as the president spoke, as that auto worker spoke, about this blind hope that what's going to happen here is a real influx of onshoring, of bringing manufacturing jobs back to this country. I should say that's something that we really have no details on, how the administration thinks that's going to happen. And again, kind of dwelling on the timetable for all of this. If that's what this White House wants to do, that's not something that can happen with any speed. And I think a lot of economists would say that's kind of folly to think that that could happen in any kind of short order, Nicole.
Elon Musk will be leaving his government role in the coming months, according to President Trump himself. Let me bring in Garrett Haake. I mean, a lot of people might look at this and say, last night, terrible for Republicans. We've seen the polling on Elon Musk, but tell us what we know about what appears to be a decision.
Well, Chris, I hate to argue with a breaking news banner here, but I think this might be less than meets the eye. What we have here is an alignment of public statements and private statements from the president and Elon Musk about how and when his tenure in and around the federal government might be ending. That is supposed to be at the 130-day mark, which is when his term as a special government employee would run up. That is, by most counts, something that happens in late May. Now we're learning, as confirmed by my colleague Gabe Gutierrez, that the president did discuss this possibility privately in a cabinet meeting that was later opened to cameras back on March 24th. That's a little more than a week ago, suggesting that Musk's work may be wrapping up soon and that this may be something where he would be returning to the private sector. The president has said the same thing publicly as recently as Monday, suggesting that, again, the work at Doge may be the kind of thing that Musk could take a step back from in the not too distant future. I think the confluence here of this special election in Wisconsin, which has drawn a lot of attention to Musk's political role out in the country and the struggles some of his businesses have had in his relative absence, combined with this, eagerness to see sort of what's next from Doge, both from Republicans who are kind of tired of defending it and from Democrats who are exhausted by its efforts, have created a lot of interest in Elon Musk's future, which I don't think is any especially clearer today than it was yesterday, except that there does seem to be a focus on the fact that his work can and should and perhaps politically must end sometime in the not too distant future, perhaps just in these next few weeks between now and the end of May.
All right, Garrett, if you have anything else that might be a little clearer, which is always a question in this administration.
Chris, the only thing I can add that's clear is the White House, I can tell you, has just come out to basically deny the substance of this reporting, calling the scoop that undergirds it garbage, and basically saying that even the president and Elon Musk have publicly made this statement. So I think what we're talking about now is a timeline of the next couple of weeks between where we stand at the beginning of April and where this 130-day clock probably runs out at the end of May. There seems to be widespread agreement that by the end of that clock, Elon Musk's role in the federal government will be different. But where we land on that calendar, I think, is still a target of a lot of reporting efforts around Washington.
President Trump prepares to impose sweeping new tariffs. Some in Congress are trying to fight back. The Senate could soon vote on a Democratic resolution that would terminate the national emergency the president has declared to justify tariffs on Canada. Politico reports the resolution may have enough Republican votes to pass. On the other side of the Capitol, New Jersey Democratic Congressman Josh Gottheimer has introduced legislation that would require the president to submit a clear strategy to Congress to justify imposing tariffs for emergency purposes. Congressman Gottheimer joins us now. It's always a pleasure to see you. He is vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus and serves on the Financial Services Committee. So, Congressman, what would your bill do?
Well, so as you were just talking about, the president is trying to use his emergency powers and claim a national emergency to impose these sweeping across the board 20% tariffs, and in Mexico and Canada 25% tariffs is what he's talking about. And these are with our allies, right, our trading partners. And he's claiming there's a national emergency. So what we're saying is, hey, explain to us in some sort of strategy, if you have one, how does this qualify as a national emergency, and why would you impose this massive tax increase, which is what this would be, $2,000 or more on Americans, on our consumers, on everything from milk to cheese to cars. You know, this is going to have a huge impact, and Moody's has said if they do go with this, the president goes these across-the-board tariffs, it will equal an immediate recession. So why would you do that to the American people? These are not our adversaries we're talking about. It's one thing if you're going after China. This is another thing if you're going after our key allies in Europe and in North and South America. It doesn't make any sense, and I'd like them to explain their strategy here if they have one.
Yeah, the White House just a little while ago put out a statement saying the tariffs do work and they are beneficial to the American economy. Take a look at Trump the first time around when there were a series of tariffs instituted to China mostly, right? But there were the threat of tariffs on Mexico. So what do you say to that?
I mean, listen, I just think this is just more chaos out of the White House, right? They're all over the place. It's, this is not a day of liberation. It's a day of chaos and cost increases on the American public. And that's what we should call this, because that's what it is. You're talking about job losses that we're facing. You're talking about hitting people's pocketbooks when we should be doing everything we can to get costs down. And by the way, I thought President Trump, that's what he ran on, to make life more affordable for people. Instead, he's actually jacking up their prices and claiming national emergencies and hurting people, right? Hurting our families, our small businesses. This is going to obviously lead to trade wars with our key allies. I don't understand why exactly you would do that to people when we're trying to help them with their costs and their pocketbooks instead of hitting them with a new tax like he's trying to do today.
And Congressman, I know that you sit on the Intelligence Committee. The Washington Post reports members of President Trump's National Security Council, including National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, have conducted government business over personal Gmail accounts, according to documents which NBC News has not reviewed independently. A National Security Council spokesman says Waltz received emails and calendar invites from legacy contacts on his personal email and CC'd government accounts for anything since January 20th to ensure compliance with records retention, and has never sent classified material over his personal email or any unsecured platform. I'm just wondering, have you or any of your colleagues that you know have used personal Gmail accounts for government business, and what's your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, this sort of takes you back to the Signal piece, right? And I have not seen this particular issue, but we saw what happened last week with Signal, right? Using Signal to, and this is why I called for the Secretary of Defense to resign immediately, because the idea that you'd share anything that could put servicemen and women in danger in any way, right, and mishandle classified information over a government device like that is, to me, totally not only irresponsible, but a reason why the Secretary of Defense should resign. Right? We know what goes on. We saw what we literally plans for an attack go out over Signal hours ahead of when the attack occurred, putting our servicemen and women in danger. Completely and totally irresponsible. You think about their parents, and you unnecessarily put anybody at risk and violate how we're supposed to handle classified information is outrageous. And what we do, so that's all I want to say is that we've got to make sure we handle these things smartly. And I'll look into what you mentioned here.
NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake is in Washington. Arvon Hilliard is at a farm in Burlington, Iowa. Also with us, incoming co-host of MSNBC's evening edition of The Weekend, Catherine Rampell, and professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan, Justin Wolfers. Garrett, do we have any more insight from the White House about whether this will be a flat tariff on all imports or just certain sectors or different levels for different countries?
Anna, the White House and the president have been giving contradictory bits of evidence and sort of hints about what will be in this package when it ultimately gets announced this afternoon. The latest guidance I have was a wave off of the idea that there would somehow be one global rate set on imports from all around the world, that this would be country by country specific, as the president and the White House use essentially a formula to figure out what those countries are charging American exporters when we export goods into those countries, plus other factors about how they manage their economies that the president has found unfair over the years. That secret sauce, though, has been kept under wraps, and the president and even his top aides are saying different things about whether what we hear today will be the ceiling or the floor for any additional tariffs going forward. We know as recently as late yesterday, there were still meetings going on this topic at the White House to finalize what's going to be rolled out. We know a little bit more about how that rollout will occur today. Of course, a 4 o'clock announcement in the Rose Garden. That's notably after the markets are closed to potentially lessen the impact of whatever is announced. And a friendly crowd will be there to watch the president make this announcement. We're told by the White House that the folks in attendance today will include workers, steam fitters, truck drivers, auto workers, the kinds of primarily blue-collar workers who the president believes could potentially most benefit from the reshoring of American jobs that have moved overseas over the years. But of course, Anna, as our economists will no doubt talk about, that kind of thing only works if this is permanent and long-lasting major economic policy shift. And we don't even know if that's going to be the case or if these are an announcement leading to a negotiation for something else down the road.
And we appreciate all of that information, what we know at this point. Garrett, thanks. Vaughn, you're in Iowa. This is a state that went for President Trump, a state with a robust agricultural sector. What are you hearing from farmers there? Are they worried?
Right. You're actually just showing the stock market ticker. And I'm actually on the farm of Jim and Terry Johnson here in Burlington, Iowa. And the way they put it to me is that they don't watch the stock market. They watch the commodities market, which shows what the price of corn, soybeans, pork is on a daily basis. And it's important to remember the context of this trade war and the fact that 7 years ago, it was these very same agricultural producers, farmers from the lobstermen and women in Maine to the soybean and corn farmers here in Iowa to the cherry and apple growers in Washington state who bared the burden of the first trade war against China, Mexico, Canada, the EU, losing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the not only tariffs, but the retaliatory tariffs that are anticipated yet again to come in response to these tariffs being announced by the U.S. president today. I want to let you listen to part of my conversation with farmer Bob Hemasath in Decorah, Iowa, who voted for now President Trump, as well as Jim and Terry Johnson, who did not. Take a listen.
I don't know where it ends. I hope it ends soon. I don't necessarily agree with the tariffs, but I want to know what markets are you looking at to open for my goods?
These tariffs are supposed to be leveling the playing field, maybe long term, but there again, we're not the only place in the world that grows corn and soybeans. People like reliable trading partners, and farmers like to be able to sell their grain.
The point made by any farmer that you talk to of essentially any good is that there are competitors to American growers. And if you take corn, for instance, Brazil, and that other countries are able to turn to other markets. And even Farmer Bob, who voted for President Trump 3 times, said that there are still long-term consequences of the first trade war. Export markets, buyers overseas who turn to other countries instead of American growers. When you're looking at corn, for instance, 30% of U.S. corn is exported. When you're looking at pork, 25% of pork is exported overseas. And that is what they fear in the months ahead, and exactly what President Trump is looking for in terms of concessions from these vast number of countries that he's now beginning trade wars with.
Vaughn Hilliard, thank you for that reporting. Garrett Haake, thanks. Keep us posted on any new developments there. Catherine, there is the impact on farmers, which Vaughn just, really laid out well for us. There's also the impact on the consumers. So how quickly could people see prices change at the grocery store, at Target, at Best Buy?
Well, obviously, it depends on what the tariffs are targeting, which, again, we still don't know, which is astonishing to me, given that they're supposed to be implemented today. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect that they would happen immediately, that we would see the price effects immediately. Some of these markets are forward-looking and may have started to price in, at the very least, the uncertainty here. But for something like automobiles, right? Automakers and dealers have been anticipating tariffs for a while, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if you show up at a dealer's lot today, the prices are going to go up. However, as these dealers start to deplete their current inventories and replace them, they will start pricing in higher prices because of these tariffs, because of the tariffs not only on the finished cars themselves, but the inputs to those cars. So it may take a few months, but the most likely consequence is that at least some of the cost of these additional import taxes will be passed along to consumers at some point.
Justin, you say this will be the biggest tax hike since the 90s. Explain.
It is. So, I mean, for viewers, what really matters is the kitchen table issues. How far can your paycheck go? This is the single biggest tax hike since 1993. They claim they'll raise $600 billion doing this. We can immediately take that $600 billion, divide by the number of households, and what that's telling you is that American households are going to have to come up with round about another $5,000 a year in order to pay for these taxes. So it's not just a tax hike. Normally, with most American taxes, the higher your income, the higher your income tax rate. But this is the sort of tax where we're taxing things like groceries, fruit and vegetables, which rich people eat as much of as poor people. So poor people are going to end up spending a larger share of their income. That is to say, this is a tax hike where the largest rise in the tax rate is for poor and middle-class Americans. So it's not only the largest tax hike in decades, it's the most regressive in living memory.
Well, Catherine, the Trump administration does say this is going to be a great thing for American businesses. And yet, here's what the CEO of Ford told investors back in February, quote, let's be real, honest, long-term, a 25% tariff across Mexico and Canada borders would blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we've never seen. This is from a U.S. automaker. So a couple different predictions here. Donald Trump, the president, keeps calling this Liberation Day today. How do you see it?
I think Donald Trump plans to liberate Americans from affordable cars, a robust economy, and basically all of our closest friends. That's what he's liberating us from. And the CEO of Ford, among other executives, are correct that, in fact, this will hurt U.S. businesses. The uncertainty alone has been terrible for them, but it will raise their costs. If we are tariffing, for example, the parts that go into automobiles, steering wheels from Mexico, steel from Canada, that's going to raise the costs of these cars, right? And again, some of that will be passed along to consumers. Some of it may be absorbed by the companies themselves, and some of it may be absorbed by workers in the form of fewer jobs or fewer hours or what have you. And we've already seen some of those announcements coming down the pike. That because of these higher costs, because of this uncertainty, companies are either holding off on hiring or outright laying off workers.
Yeah, talk about that, Justin, the impact on the American worker, because we keep hearing President Trump argue that this will create incentive for people to buy American. It will lead to a boost in U.S. production. It will create more jobs here as businesses boost that manufacturing at home. When would that happen? If those jobs do come, will they be good paying jobs? How do you see it?
Well, the good paying jobs is really worth talking to because the American public and the White House have something of an obsession with manufacturing. But it's worth noting, actually, that manufacturing jobs are not particularly well paying. They're below average. But I think I want to take a step back and think about it. The idea is to try and bring more factories to the United States. Now, it takes a long time to build a factory. So if I'm thinking about building a factory, I'm not thinking about the tariff rate today. I'm thinking about the tariff rate by the time the factory's built, say 2028, and then over the ensuing several decades the factory's open, over the next 30 or 40 years. The problem with the Trump White House chaos is that by the end of today, we'll know what the tariff rate is on April 1st, 2025, but we will have no idea what that means for 2026, 2030, 2040, and so on. And so if he's not actually shifting people's expectations of the long-run future, he's not going to get any of the benefits that he's hoping for.
Joining us now, former Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, Charlie Dent. He is also the executive director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program, and Faz Shakir, advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, and the executive director of More Perfect Union. So, Charlie, what was your takeaway from both Florida and Wisconsin?
Yeah, my takeaway is this. First, I never try to read too much into special elections because the turnout models are different than a midterm or presidential. You may remember in 2023, Democrats did very well in the Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, but only to lose the state to President Trump in 2024. That said, if I'm a Republican, I should be very nervous. Between Lancaster, Pennsylvania last week, Wisconsin last night, and Republicans underperforming pretty significantly in two very ruby red districts, it's clear that the Democrats are very angry and energized and motivated. And that they are cutting into Republican margins. So if you're a Republican who's going to run in anything that's less than about a plus 10 Republican 10 district, you're going to be in one of those seats. You're going to have to be in for the fight of your life. So Republicans are in the headwind.
Charlie, I mean, just looking at the two Florida districts, I mean, they both went for what, plus 30, with the other one plus 36, yep. Not only for Trump this last time, but also even the electoral battle between Republican and Democrat. Is this a change, or do you think because of the special election nature of it, it was just a matter of fewer people coming out?
Well, there are always fewer people coming out, and I think Democrats tend to do better with these voters in these special elections. They do a better job turning out. But again, having said that, these are districts that should not have even been contested. I mean, these are, again, such ruby red plus 36, plus 30 districts for Republicans. They shouldn't be competitive. And those margins were essentially cut in half. And we saw the same thing in Lancaster, Pennsylvania last week, in one of the most Republican and conservative areas of the state. In fact, it's the most Republican performing area of the state since Abraham Lincoln. And they lost a state Senate seat. They never lose there. So with a solid Republican candidate. So as I'm looking at this, Republicans know they're going to be in for a really tough midterm because of all the chaos, the Doge, and probably the tariffs, the economic anxiety. So they're going to be running into a strong wind. And they have to just be ready for it.
Faz, what do you think is the message from last night's results?
Well, I was out there with Senator Sanders in Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago in Altoona and Kenosha, and you saw thousands and thousands of people already turning out. The people are way ahead of the Democratic Party right now. There's still an issue with the Democratic Party brand, whether people want to be associated and affiliated with it. But I think the opportunity is there. If more Democrats with integrity are comfortable with taking on political corruption, the concentration of wealth and power, that is where a lot of the anger in America comes from right now, seeing the hubris with the way in which Elon Musk operates, a sense of who cares? I can just press delete on a spreadsheet. It doesn't much matter if you're angry. You can just tweet at me. That's what you can do. And that kind of lack of integrity of giving any kind of a damn about regular people, if we can tap that, if the Democratic Party can reorient around that class consciousness, we'll do great.
Faz, how do they do that? And you were saying that there's a big divide between what the people feel and think and the party. I guess you're talking also about the party leadership, right? But how does that divide become shorter?
Well, I do think there's an opportunity for persuasion at this moment. There's a lot of people who voted for, Trump or didn't sat out this election. And I would have them at the forefront of our minds as people we want to recruit back. People are upset at government. It works inefficiently, and they're right about that. But do you believe in an arsonist to come in and just mow down the government? Or do you want intelligent and good government reforms, people who would cut the Pentagon budget, who would take on Medicare Advantage overpayments and audit the Fed or do things.
But who never have, Faz, who never have. It just seems like none of them actually has. Nobody.
But I think that people are getting this message that you've got to be for a government reform that makes sense. I do think there's a shift going on. And my argument, Jose, is that people are sensing it. If you watch some of the Florida candidates, by the way, when they were campaigning, Josh Wheel and others, they were talking in a very different populist way than you would have normally seen Democrats talking. And I'm happy about that.
Charlie, almost $100 million spent by both sides on the Supreme Court race. Musk spent plus 20 or so. million. What do you make of the scale of spending? And you were just talking about that in not only in Wisconsin, but also in Florida. What do you see in the scale of spending on these races?
Well, yeah, it's not just this Supreme Court race was astounding in terms of the amount of money spent, but we're also seeing it in these congressional races. The amount of money spent in my old congressional seat was staggering. I think it was well over $20 million. I've forgotten the exact numbers. These numbers are just enormous. And I don't know. I mean, maybe at some point we hate to use the term campaign finance reform because every time we fix the system, it seems to get worse. But I'm not sure I have an answer to this question. But between the super PACs, the 501c4s, wealthy individuals are just dumping money in on both sides, and the stakes are high. And we're going to continue to see this, even in what I would consider to be lower profile races like a state Supreme Court race.
Yeah, in fact, just going back to the point that you were just mentioning about that divide, Democratic Senator Cory Booker set a record for the longest continuous Senate speech after speaking for more than 25 hours in opposition of the president's agenda. Here's part of his closing remarks last night.
I don't think that our founders would have ever imagined a body like this, with black people on both sides, abruptly stopped, along with vaccination programs and programs for stopping diseases such as Ebola, monkeypox. I believe that there is an urgent crisis in our country that we are not talking about. It's not a left-right crisis, it's a right-wrong crisis. It's a moral moment, and again, in America that's going to define our character, about who we are and what we stand for.
And Faz, back to the issue of some people saying it's time to go past talking and seeing action. Is Senator Booker one of the emerging voices of the new Democratic base?
Well, I think he was right to employ this tactic, which is to say, I'm going to hold the floor and I'm going to meet a couple of things here. One is I'm going to educate people about what is going on, and you're going to see the way in which I engage education of what's going on. I'm going to show you a desire for a fight, a desire of spending, emotional capital to kind of compel you around a different vision of government. I think people are hunting for integrity at this moment. The point Charlie made, money influences all. Money influences our economy. Money influences our politics. Who is willing to stand up against it? And I would say on that point, there's been efforts to try to rein in super PAC spending. In fact, in the last election cycle, Maine passed a ballot measure to say super PACs shouldn't be able to just give whatever into a race in Maine. And I think I'd like to see more states take these efforts and say, hey, we're not going to allow our elections to be bought by just the highest funder, because otherwise it turns into a downward cycle until we get to public financing of campaigns, which is where I'd like to go.
Charlie Dent and Faz Shakir, thank you both so very much.